In the spring of the 1800s, deep in the forests of Michigan, a young Native American man named William Cloud left his tribe and went to work alongside white lumbermen. The men called him Cloudy. He found work at a logging camp near Alger, Michigan, where he operated a log chute along a remote creek, roughly a mile and a half outside the village. It was hard, dangerous work. The lumberjacks spent their days cutting down massive trees and loading the logs onto rafts. Then they would float the timber downstream until they reached a huge wooden chute. At the chute was a heavy gate designed to hold the logs back. When the gate was finally raised, the logs would thunder through the rushing water and continue down the creek. Cloudy didn't complain about the work. He was quiet. Almost strangely quiet. He rarely spoke unless someone asked him a question. But there was one thing the lumberjacks could always get him to talk about: ghost stories. Whenever the men gathered around the fire at night, they would ask Cloudy to tell them the legends he'd heard from the elders of his people. And there was one story he told more often than any other, a story about something that lived beneath the waters of their creek. The lumberjacks called it the Wraith. Cloudy would lower his voice and tell them that the old one spoke of an evil creature that hunted human beings. It was said to hide beneath the dark, murky waters of the creek. It had horns like a devil and a body covered in pale, ghostly scales. And after midnight, when the spirits were believed to wander freely, the creature would rise from the water and wait for someone to come too close. If a person wandered into its reach, the Wraith would strike. It would wrap its unnaturally long arms around its victim and then, with its terrible claws, tear them apart and drag what remained down into the depths. The lumberjacks usually laughed when Cloudy finished the story. They thought it was just an old legend, a frightening tale told to pass the time. Until one night in April. That spring, the rains had been unusually heavy. The creek had swollen to a dangerous height, its dark water rushing violently through the forest. Then, one cold and miserable night, the lumberjacks received an order. The gate at the log chute had to be lowered so the logs could be sent downstream. But there was a problem. Outside, it was almost completely dark. Rain hammered the cabin roof. Wind tore through the trees. And nobody wanted to walk down to the creek in the middle of that storm. So the men decided to draw lots. Whoever drew the short straw would have to go. They gathered together. One by one, the men reached for the slips. And eventually, Cloudy drew the short straw. The room went quiet. Cloudy didn't argue. He didn't complain. He simply stood up, opened the cabin door, and stepped into the storm. The door slammed shut behind him. And Cloudy disappeared into the darkness. The men waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. Rain continued pounding against the windows. An hour went by. Still no Cloudy. At first, the men joked about it. Maybe he'd gotten lost. Maybe the storm had slowed him down. Then someone laughed nervously. Maybe the Wraith got him. A few men laughed. But nobody laughed for long. Because another hour was beginning to pass. And Cloudy still hadn't returned. Finally, the men decided they couldn't wait any longer. They grabbed a lantern and headed into the storm. The forest was almost completely black. Rain poured down around them as they struggled along the muddy trail toward the creek. The lantern was their only source of light. Eventually, they reached the log chute. One of the men stepped forward and held the lantern over the edge. He looked down into the rushing, muddy water. For several seconds, nothing. Then his eyes caught something drifting below. Something pale. Something strangely shaped. He leaned closer. And suddenly, he screamed. Something was floating in the creek. The men rushed toward him. And there, beneath the weak glow of the lantern, they saw the body of Cloudy. What they found terrified them. His body had been horribly mutilated. He appeared to have been torn apart by something with tremendous force. His head was barely attached. The men stood frozen in silence. None of them could explain what they were looking at. They raised the heavy gate and used long poles to pull Cloudy's body from the water. But even after they dragged him onto the bank, nobody could explain how it had happened. There were no witnesses. No clear explanation. Only the storm, the rushing creek, and Cloudy's body. By the next morning, word had spread throughout the logging camp. The men whispered that the old story had been true. The Wraith really did live in the creek. And it had finally claimed a victim. Fear spread through the camp. One by one, the lumberjacks began packing their belongings. Some refused to go anywhere near the creek. Others wouldn't even stay inside the camp after dark. Cloudy was buried near the water. A small marker was placed over his grave. And by sundown, the entire logging camp had been abandoned. The men were gone. The cabins were empty. And the forest fell silent once again. But the story didn't end there. According to the legend, the Wraith still lurks beneath the dark waters of that creek, waiting and watching for someone foolish enough to wander too close to the edge. But there's another part of the legend. A darker one. They say Cloudy's spirit never left. His ghost is said to wander along the banks of the creek, protecting others from the creature that supposedly took his life. Some say that if you walk near the water late at night, you may hear something moving among the trees. Then comes a low, terrible groan. And sometimes, a piercing scream from somewhere in the darkness. Those who hear it are said to run. Because according to the legend, Cloudy isn't trying to hurt them. He's warning them. Warning them to stay away from the water. Warning them that something is still waiting beneath the surface. Something with horns, white scales, and long, terrible claws. And if the old story is true, the Wraith is still down there. Still waiting.